2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock.
Hello and welcome to the Decades in Time, the 1950s. The 1950s was a time in American history where most Americans were living the American dream. It was a time when family mattered and friendship is key. Some say it was hard, some say it was easy, some say it was nice, others say it was rough. This is what life was like in the 1950s. Lifestyle and social trends are one of the most dynamic aspects in history because it is a time where in every decade it changes. African Americans had more rights than they did in the past, but they were still discriminated and seen as second-class citizens. Meanwhile, there are a handful of people who were tired of the social difference and stood up for themselves in their community. They are called civil rights movement leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., along with Rosa Parks. The people in the 1950s believed that peace and tranquility would be possible, so they decided to have babies, hence the baby boom, and the population grew more than 30%. This caused schools to overcrowd and a lot of teachers being overworked. Meanwhile, the role of the women has gone back to its traditional ways after the men came back from the war. Many advertisements in magazines and TV shows defined the roles of motherhood somewhat, and society believed women fit this role. The rate for women dropping out of colleges had a very significant impact in the 1950s. A lot of women dropped out and they were planning on not working towards a job now. The husbands bought the groceries because he had the car. He could also drive the children now as well. Since the husbands are away at work, all the time the wives would have to do is a lot of manual work around the house. There was a large-scale consumerism in the 1950s which caused competition between people like neighbors who loved to compete on housekeeping. Someone had the nicest lawn, then the others had to have the nicest lawn as well. Art in the 1950s. The 1950s artists emerged in a climate of turbulence, experimentation, and consumerism. The best generation was a group of American writers and artists who were popular in the 1950s. They were often referred to as beatniks, and were influenced by Eastern philosophy and religion, and famous for their use of interesting forms of writing and their rejection of traditional social and artistic principles. The beat writings usually pushed the boundaries of acceptance in the 1950s. Rock and roll evolved in the United States in the early 1950s and quickly spread to the rest of the world. Rock and roll is not just a musical style, but it also influenced lifestyles, fashions, attitudes, and languages. When Billie Harley's Rock Around the Clock came out in 1955, it was considered the first rock and roll song. Teenagers immediately fell in love with it. Elvis Presley is known as the rock and roll king because he is good looking, had a unique sound, and delivered an electric performance that made girls faint. During this time period, many people were identified by the way they dressed and presented themselves. It was similar to an unwritten dress code that everybody knew and adhered to. In this time period, men dressed in suits and women wore dresses. The general rule is the more expensive the suit, the better of a job you worked. For example, an executive would wear a very classy suit, while men who worked as a general employee would wear something less elaborate, more like a polo and khakis. They also had typically a specified fabric for certain times of the year. Like in the summer, a lighter, cooler fabric was used, while in contrast, in winter, a thicker fabric such as wool would be incorporated to the inside of the suit. Women during this time period primarily wore dresses with a matching hat and bag. However, the traditional dress is becoming less common as women begin to wear pencil skirts, or skirts that would show off a figure-8 body without being too provocative. They, no matter what they wore, always matched and had some style going with them. They were often expected to wear uncomfortable undergarments that were a must during this decade. The 1950s were a time of big change for media, with the improvements in technology greatly changing media itself. Radios would still run American life, while the changes to the book and newspaper industries meant that publishing saw a new revolution. Most incredible of the introduction of television, however, TV meant new technology would soon lose popularity. The Federal Communications Commission regulates and licenses TVs, phones, telegraphs, radios, and other communications, and they allowed 500 new TV stations to broadcast in 1956. The television industry was criticized for a stereotypical portrayal of women and minorities. Women were often portrayed as the ideal mothers and were outnumbered by men 3-1. Shows often portrayed and idolized a white American and rarely featured African Americans and Latinos. Even though the popularity of TV, people still saw movies because of the size of the screen and the color, which was not common on TVs, and the stereophonic sound that surrounded the audience. The movie industry also tried new inventions like the CinemaScope, Smell-O-Vision, Aroma-Rama, and 3D movies. Radios began broadcasting news, weather, music, and community issues so they wouldn't have to compete with TVs. Radio advertising rose 35% despite the new invention, and the number of stations increased 50% despite the popularity of TV.
Is it human or inhuman? Earthly or unearthly? Baffling questions, astounding questions that not even the world's greatest scientific minds can answer. Gentlemen, you realize this is a being from another world, different from us, one whole of the greenhouse was Come here. Get in the corner. Now hold this in front of you. Stay by the light switch.
1.9. Needles hit the top.
I must follow him. Ever since he touched my hand, I knew that near him I always must be, and nothing can keep him from me. He is
Science and technology have always been a very integral part of life. It is very important, for it helps us get by day to day. However, all technology had to start from somewhere, and some of our technology that we still use today actually comes from the 1950s. Some medical research is actually very vital in some crime solving and medical finding solutions. In 1953, two scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, also known as Watson and Crick, were trying to put together a model of DNA. They also found that if they paired a thymine with an adenine and a guanine with a cytosine, the DNA would look uniform. This pairing was also in accordance with the Chargaff's rule. Another vital part of the 1950s, more towards the late end though, is the space race and the traveling to space. Although the actual landing of an astronaut on the moon does not take place until the 1960s, there is still a lot of science that was done in the late 1950s. Like for example, Sputnik, which went up, which is the first Russian satellite to go up. And then we sent up Laika, the first dog into outer space, also the first living thing. Thus, it also started the space race, which then led to more competition between countries internationally. These are cars in the 1950s. Cars were a very vital part because they provided the main means of transportation, as they still do today. The Chevrolet Bel Air convertible was one of the most iconic cars during its era. The 1950s probably perhaps has the most car usage after World War II than any other decade, except for this present day. The fastest cars, the 1958 Chevrolet, could go from 0 to 60 in 7.6 seconds. And then next up was the Ferrari, and then the Porsche. These are some of the very fastest cars, but of course with speed comes great cost. Also, TV companies tended to use vans to get around for reporting the news. In the back, you'd notice all their equipment, along with cameras and microphones and a whole lot of other broadcasting stuff in order for it to get back to the newsroom.